International migration in most cases requires people to follow rules. Migrants often need to carry a passport, get a visa to enter foreign countries, be approved for residency in those countries, and even separately apply for permission to work. When migrants successfully obtain all of these documents and permissions, we can say that they migrated regularly, meaning they acted in accordance with the rules governing movement during their journey. In an ideal world, that would be the end of the story. But every year, there's a portion of migrants who either do not or cannot follow all of the rules. Let's focus on this group and find out the ways people can migrate irregularly, how their status can flip-flop between regularity and irregularity, and of course, how we collect data on this population. First off, what's the difference between this group and the illegal migrants we hear about in the news? Well, these terms describe the same group, but migration scholars and a fair amount of lawmakers agree that the word illegal paints an inaccurate picture. It is entirely possible for people to do illegal things, but it's not possible for a person to be illegal. Not to mention, being in a country without all of the required documents is not a criminal offense in most cases. It is just an administrative issue. To use the term illegal to refer to migrants or migration gives the wrong connotation and associates migrants with criminality when that often could not be further from the truth. To reflect this reality, we use the word irregular to describe someone's migration status when they do not have all of their administrative affairs in order. So for this video, we will proceed with using the term irregular migrant rather than illegal, since it simply does a better and more fair job of describing our population of interest. Now, while we have an idea of how irregularity arises during global migration, let's consider some specific instances. Keep in mind that there is no universal definition of irregular migration, but there is some consensus in the migration field about situations where irregularity arises. There are three main ways that irregularity can arise: irregular entry, irregular stay, and irregular work. Sometimes a fourth way is discussed, that is, rejected asylum seekers, but we will categorize this group under irregular stay, although they could have also entered irregularly. Let's first consider someone who enters a country without passing through immigration controls and officially does not have the right to enter the country. That is, they don't get their passport checked and stamped at an entry point on the border. Here, we're seeing irregular entry, and this type of irregular migration generates high levels of attention in the media. But here is where mass media gives us a misguided understanding. Take the United States, for example. The majority of migrants in the country with irregular status did not enter irregularly. They came in with perfectly valid tourist visas or other such entry permissions. Their status changed to irregular, however, when their visas expired, and yet they remained in the country. We refer to this as irregular stay. Another type of irregular stay is when someone has their asylum claim rejected and no longer has the right to stay, but does not leave. During the time of the assessment of their asylum claim, they have the right to stay, but after a rejection, they no longer have the right to stay. What we're starting to uncover here is that irregularity describes a portion of migrants' experience. This is useful because we can pinpoint a person's source of irregularity and understand their circumstances in a more detailed and precise way. There is one more commonly observed source of irregularity tied to employment. For countries requiring migrants to have a special permit to work, we see groups that work without this authorization. We can call this irregular work or employment, although the term undocumented work is also commonly used and also correct. Since migrants can experience both some regular and some irregular situations during their migration, they can slip in and out of irregularity. This sounds complex, but makes sense when you think about it. Let's go back to our United States example and picture a common occurrence. Someone from Venezuela is granted a tourist visa and boards a flight to the United States. Upon arrival, they pass through immigration control and are allowed into the country because they have a perfectly valid documentation. Their migration status up to this point is completely regular. To maintain this regular status, they would have to leave the country before their visa expires. If, however, they do not exit the U.S., they will slip into irregular stay the instant that the visa expires. This is an example of slipping into irregularity, but we also see the opposite happen. There are a fair amount of regularization programs across the world that offer migrants an opportunity to fix administrative issues regarding their migration status. This means allowing migrants with an irregular status to obtain residence or work permits, which would then regularize their status in that country. There are also a number of other ways that people could become regular, like, for instance, marrying someone from the country of destination, or perhaps deciding to study and then getting a study visa, and many other possibilities. Regularization is not just important from an administrative standpoint, it is even required by international law in some cases, particularly for asylum seekers. States recognizing the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees are required to provide protection to vulnerable migrants such as trafficking victims, unaccompanied children, and those fleeing violence. The catch, however, is that these groups usually have to enter the country irregularly before claiming the right to protection because it's often so difficult to enter some countries. Reasons for this vary, but a common reason is that vulnerable populations often do not have the resources or support to get an entry visa for a country that could and would protect them. Also, in reality, many countries purposefully make it very difficult to enter them. Faced with this reality, the 1951 Convention's authors added a stipulation saying that refugees cannot be penalized for irregular entry or irregular stay if they traveled from a place where they were genuinely at risk. Applying this exemption to refugees means that simply applying for asylum or protection from a country does not erase irregular entry from someone's record. Only those who are actually granted such legal protection, called asylum, are classified as refugees, and then they get to have their irregular status wiped away. This rule is important from a safety perspective because administrative barriers should never stop someone in danger from seeking protection. Now that we have a clearer picture of who the term irregular migration can apply to, we will look at how to estimate the size of this population. The cold reality is that there is no perfect way to measure a population that flies under the administrative radar. So, how do you count a population that doesn't go through standard migration procedures and in reality doesn't want to be counted? Despite this dilemma, we have a few ways to estimate both stocks and flows of irregular migrants. Don't forget to brush up on the difference between stocks and flows via the link in the description. To estimate the stock of irregular migrants in a country, the most obvious data source would be the number of people caught staying there irregularly and the number of deportations or forced returns. We can also count the number of times employers are fined for hiring people with an irregular work status, meaning they don't have the right to work. Finally, countries with regularization programs can count the number of people applying for regularization to get an idea of their irregular migrant population. We can also look at the number of people who are told they no longer have the right to stay in a country but do not leave. While measuring stocks of irregular migrants focuses on irregular stay and employment, estimating flows focuses on irregular entry since this measurement takes place at borders. The two main ways to estimate the number of irregular entries is to count the number of people caught trying to cross a border irregularly, and then add that to the number of people turned away from entering at an official immigration point. Of course, what we'd obviously be missing in these estimates are the numbers of migrants who successfully enter a country irregularly without getting caught. So all of these typical ways of addressing irregular migration are usually underestimates of the real number. Often, the best way to get a more precise number of irregular migrants is through the census in a country, since every person is supposed to be counted regardless of status. A census, however, usually only happens every 10 years, and still does have a hard time counting populations that do not want to be counted. That's the quick picture of why the term illegal should not be used to describe migrants, how single or multiple parts of a journey can be irregular, and the challenges we face when trying to measure irregular migration. I hope this gave you a better understanding of how complex this topic can be and how it's not accurately discussed in mass media. Maybe you can be an agent of change by sharing this video with your family, friends, and coworkers. If you made it to the end of this video, I hope you'll subscribe to get notified about my future videos. Liking and comment on this video will also help it reach new audiences. See you next time.